When we picture the year 1492, we usually imagine standing on the deck of a European galleon, staring westward toward an unknown horizon. To accurately trace what happened next, we have to flip that map around. We need to stand on the American shoreline, looking east. This map shows a few indigenous nations, like the Iroquois, Seneca, Cherokee, and Pima. Pre-contact Americas hosted thousands of sovereign tribes, yet their historical accounts reveal a shared thread. Their identity was completely locked into their local topography, the rivers, soil, and wildlife around them. Everything about this way of life depended on that connection to the land. When that bond was severed, the entire foundation of their world began to shift. Creation accounts like the Earth Diver or emergence myths provided the instructions for living. They defined how these communities perceived their place in the universe and dictated how they interacted with everything around them. In these traditions, humans and animals act as collaborative equals, working side by side on a level playing field. This contrasts sharply with the European Great Chain of Being. That system placed humans at the top of a strict vertical hierarchy, acting as absolute masters over nature. Because native societies relied heavily on balance, they used a storytelling device called the trickster to explain chaos. The trickster acts unpredictably and selfishly, demonstrating the consequences when individuals break the social boundaries needed to keep their community alive. These tribes maintained a finely tuned system of mutual respect and clear social rules. When an alien force suddenly arrived off the coast playing by an entirely different set of rules, the result was a total breakdown of logic. When those European vessels first appeared on the horizon, the indigenous populations did not instantly recognize the crews as conquerors. They had no precedent for global colonization. Instead, they actively tried to process these bizarre arrivals by filtering them through their own established worldview. They looked at these strangers and categorized them as spirits, deities, or perhaps unpredictable trickster figures. Because their culture prioritized balance, native communities met these early explorers with hospitality. They accepted gifts from the Europeans and offered crucial assistance, driven by their own societal rules of politeness and spiritual duty. This initial cooperation is frequently misread as weakness. In reality, the native communities were making a deliberate, calculated attempt to weave these newcomers into their existing cooperative social fabric. The native expectation was clear. In exchange for keeping the Europeans alive by teaching them how to navigate the land and grow food, the newcomers were expected to act as respectful co-creators. The Europeans, however, operated within their hierarchical worldview. They looked at this eager cooperation and interpreted it as absolute submission to their dominion. The relationship broke down because the colonizers repeatedly violated the established social boundaries of their hosts. To the native tribes, the Europeans were acting exactly like the chaotic, destructive trickster figures from their stories. Trying to spiritually categorize the explorers made perfect sense within the native framework, but it proved to be a fatal miscalculation against a foreign power built entirely around the concept of conquest. When we jump forward in the timeline and read the native historical accounts recorded years later, the tone changes completely. The optimism of those early encounters is replaced by the bitter realization of what was being taken. The colonizers introduced specific mechanisms that fractured these societies. Millions died from unfamiliar foreign diseases, while the targeted introduction of alcohol and exploitative commercial trade routes tore at the social fabric. These elements worked together as a systemic poison. They actively broke apart the tightly interwoven land-based ecosystem that native tribes had successfully maintained for centuries. The colonizers seized millions of acres of physical territory, but the deeper tragedy lies in their intentional shattering of an entire philosophy of mutual cooperation. Today, reading these native historical accounts gives us a vital record of a complex philosophical world that the colonizers tried to overwrite entirely. Even after two incompatible systems crashed into one another, shattering the established infrastructure of the land, indigenous identity didn't disappear. The traditions, the stories, and the descendants of those original tribes have survived. The history of contract in the Americas is ultimately the story of a civilization built on ecological balance, meeting an empire built on rigid hierarchy. To properly understand the history of this continent, we have to look past the political borders drawn on our modern maps. We must recognize the spiritual geography that defined this land long before the first ships arrived, a map that was rewritten but never entirely erased.